Hi. So on this episode of Bookshelf A to Z, we're going to be talking about Little Women, the novel by Louisa May Alcott, um, which is a novel that I've always wanted to read, but never got around to doing it. Which is again the whole purpose of this Bookshelf A to Z is to, read the books that I own and just never read for whatever reason. Little Women, the novel, is actually two novels. The first one, published in 1868, was titled Little Women and followed the March sisters as they were still young girls who were growing up and the trials and tribulations that they faced in their lives as children. The second novel, called Good Wives, was published the following year in 1869 and again continued the story of the March sisters, but now after a time jump of a few years, and showed the sisters as they were, not as girls, but as wives and young women who were out in the world finding jobs and husbands. The two novels were then published together, starting in 1880, using only the title Little Women, and thus they've been known ever since. The novel is a classic example of a Bildungsroman, or coming-of-age novel, and though it was by no means the first, it is certainly one of the most widely known and influential. Earlier examples of the genre are Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte and David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, both novels that we will be getting to later on in the series, because I own both of those novels, so that'll be exciting. Though it won't be till Actually, Jane Eyre will be pretty soon. Well, relatively soon. I can't see it. It's up there somewhere. And then Charles Dickens is right here. You can't see that. That's off the screen. Both of those prior novels would have been known to Alcott when she was writing her own novel, especially Dickens, whom Alcott repeatedly references throughout Little Women, most notably in the naming conventions of the Pickwick Club, named after Dickens's Pickwick Papers, a novel that we will not be reading. What is notably different from those earlier works compared to Alcott's, other than the nation of origin, is that they seem to have had a different purpose to Alcott's work. Jane Eyre and David Copperfield, although they are both steeped in Christianity and the reforming air of the societies in which they were written, are neither so overtly Christian nor so overtly didactic as Little Women is. Beginning in the 1850s and continuing into the 20th century, America was undergoing a large change in the religious life of its people. This movement, called the Third Great Awakening, promoted social activism over moral causes such as slave abolition, prohibition, women's suffrage, and child labor reform. Now, I'm not going to get too far into the theological deep for this video, but I do want to discuss the primary theological element that caused Christians to take on such public social stands, which is millennialism. Now, millennialism, not to be confused with millennials, the name of the generation, deals with the return of Jesus Christ to earth at the end of time. Millennialists believe that there will be a 1,000-year-long reign of peace, hence millennium, before the final judgment day. While many Christians today, especially modern evangelical Christians, are premillennials, meaning that they believe that Jesus will come down to earth before the 1,000-year-long reign, Christians of the 19th century were primarily post-millennials, meaning that they believed that Jesus would only come down after the 1,000 years of peace had already begun. Hence, it was important for them to create that, earthly utopia. And it might seem like a small difference, but it's actually a huge change. For premillennials, the state of the world doesn't really matter, since Jesus will perfect the world when he comes, and it isn't the job of Christians to do so. But for the reform-minded post-millennials, it was necessary for them to work to making the kingdom of God on earth before the end of times could actually happen. Post-millennialists believe that it is the duty of every Christian to make the world a better place, hence the emphasis on social movements involving slavery, women's rights, etc., etc. They were striving for this better world in order to begin the 1,000 years of peace that will bring about the saving of mankind through Jesus. As a side note, post-millennial beliefs also caused an uptick of socialist communes throughout the American Midwest as it was being settled by the awakened Protestants during this period, such as the various Harmony colonies, Oberlin, Brook Farm, the Oneida community, the early Mormon church under Joseph Smith, and most importantly for art purposes, Fruitlands, where Louisa May Alcott and her husband Amos tried to set up a community similar to the one that Jo and her husband create at the end of Little Women. Yes, that's right. Socialism and communes are actually just as old as America, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. The narrative of Little Women is less one continuous story like that of David Copperfield or Jane Eyre, and more episodic in nature like that later boys' book, Tom Sawyer, with each episode being 1 to 2 chapters long and each ending with a moral lesson for the girls. From the very first episode, we can see the shape of the rest of the novel in this way. The novel begins at Christmas, arguably the most important day for Christians, at least after the Christmas revival that was spearheaded by Alcott's favorite author, Dickens. And we see in the 2 chapters the basic plot line of all of the scenes that make up the novel. The girls are at first selfish, wanting to spend what little pocket money they have on themselves, and they discuss it together and decide that instead of being selfish, they would give up their pocket money in order to get their mother, Marmee, a Christmas present, thus showing off their virtue of charity. But that charity is still not complete. After all, Marmee is still their mother and not really in need of their charity. Christmas morning itself opens up with each of the girls finding their present from Marmee, a hardcover copy of a book that is not mentioned by name, but is probably, almost certainly, the Gospels, the way they talk about it. They refer to it as the best of all lives. So it's a little confusing. It never mentions by name that it's the Gospel. Some people argue that it's Paul Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, but that doesn't really seem likely to me personally. But be that as it may. Upon seeing the gift they have received, Meg shows us what good Christians ought to do, saying, quote, "Girls, Mother wants us to read and love and mind these books, and we must begin at once. We used to be faithful about it, but since Father went away and all this war's trouble unsettled us, we have neglected many things. You can do as you please, but I shall keep my book on the table here and read a little every morning as soon as I wake, for I know it will do me good and help me through the day." At which point the girls all read diligently from their Gospels, setting them up for the even greater act of charity that will follow, both that day and throughout the novel. Marmee, unlike her daughters, is actually outperforming the charity work demanded of Christians, or at least Christians in the middle of the Third Great Awakening. And when she returns, it is to push her daughters to the same level of charity. Quote, "Merry Christmas, little daughters. Not far away from here lies a poor woman with a little newborn baby. 6 children are huddled into one bed to keep from freezing, for they have no fire. There is nothing to eat over there, and the oldest boy came to tell me they are suffering hunger and cold. My girls, will you give them your breakfast as a Christmas present?" This they do with great outward aplomb, but with inward sadness, only for them to be rewarded in the end when Mr. Lawrence, their wealthy neighbor, secretly witnesses their charity work and gives them a marvelous Christmas dinner to make up for the lack of a Christmas breakfast. This charity work continues throughout the novel, showing that the lesson is not meant as a one-off, but to be a continuous lesson for the girls and, by extension, for us, the readers. Although Alcott does add the realism that not all charity goes rewarded immediately, and oftentimes leads to further hardship, since it is the same poor German family that Beth is helping when she comes down with scarlet fever later in the novel. Although, it is important to note that Beth doesn't actually die of the scarlet fever, as is shown in the film versions of the novel, but instead wastes away in a similar vein to those romantic heroines dying of consumption. It's a nod to the kind of novels that Alcott was reading, the Bronte-style novels. Not every episode is so neatly wrapped up, of course, but this first Christmas scene acts as the blueprint from which all the others deviate. But what are the morals that are imparted upon the girls and on us? Other than charity, of course. One would expect that a novel which takes place during and in the immediate aftermath of the American Civil War a war which was mainly fought over slavery and in which Alcott participated as a nurse with the Union Army, uh, to discuss racial segregation and racial issues. However, the novel never directly addresses slavery, likely since the novel was actually written after emancipation and had already occurred, and therefore it was no longer an issue worth mentioning. In fact, the only non-white character that is mentioned in the whole novel is at the very end, when Jo has created her home for boys. A list of the types of boys that she takes in is given. Quote, "There were slow boys and bashful boys, feeble boys and riotous boys, boys that lisped and boys that stuttered, one or two lame ones, and a merry little quadroon, who could not be taken in elsewhere, but who was welcome to the bear garden, though some people predicted that his admission would ruin the school." So there's an acknowledgement that there is racism within the society, but it is kind of glossed over. And boy, I guess you gotta just take what you can get from a novel in 1869. It could have been worse. There is worse. As we noted when talking about Achebe, what is it? 40, 60 years later, you'd still be getting novels like Heart of Darkness. So you take what you can get. The novel also mentions temperance, most notably at Meg's wedding, where she extracts a promise from Laurie to not drink alcohol, a promise which he takes very seriously. But the novel is mostly concerned with the role of women. Even when discussing race and temperance, the emphasis is on women's role in pushing for those reforms. The most obvious example of women's power and duty to help reform society is seen in Jo's plotline, where she attempts to become a writer. At first, Jo writes simple fairy tales like stories, but when she tries to get published, she begins writing what can probably be best described as penny dreadfuls, stories where any sort of morality is expressly unwanted. Her publisher even tells her that, quote, "People want to be amused, not preached at, Morals don't sell nowadays." Jo is conflicted about this statement, but the money helps her get over it, and she begins to make quite a decent living off of her writing. However, when her future husband, the German Professor Baer, finds out that she is writing such immoral things, he tells her off for it, saying that no good Christian would ever write such things. Quote, "If the respectable people know what harm they did, they would not feel that the living was honest. They have no right to put poison in the sugar plum and let the small ones eat it. No, they should think a little and sweep mud in the street before they do this thing." Taking this criticism to heart, Jo attempts to write more moral stories, but fails commercially. However, she takes comfort in being a good person, for whatever that's worth. With the emphasis on feminine moralizing comes obviously an emphasis on motherhood. Marmee is the main source of moral education. Mr. March, being off at war, is nearly a non-entity in the first half of the novel, and even when he returns, he really only acts to reinforce the instruction that Marmee has already given. Alcott hasn't completely broken from Christian paternalism entirely, though, since Marmee famously gives credit to her husband for her patience and moral beliefs, saying, quote, "For years I had to struggle on alone, for I was too proud to confess my weakness to anyone else. I had a hard time, Jo, and shed a good many bitter tears over my failures. For in spite of my efforts, I never seemed to get on. Then your father came, and I was so happy that I found it easy to be good. Your father, Jo, he never loses patience, never doubts or complains, but always hopes and works and waits so cheerfully that one is ashamed to do otherwise before him. He helped and comforted me, and showed me that I must try to practice all the virtues I would have my little girls possess, for I was their example." The way she speaks of her husband is reminiscent not of a mortal man, but of God himself, which is pointed since for Christians God is seen as being a heavenly father. But even still, it is the mother that is the focus of moral instruction in the home. Marmee teaches her daughters, and even Laurie on occasion. Meg becomes a mother. Jo mothers Laurie, and then continues to be a mother at her home for boys. Even little Amy eventually becomes a moral force for Laurie after Jo rejects his proposal. The only one of the daughters that doesn't become a mother is Beth, who dies before she is grown, although it's worth noting that she was the most motherly of all the sisters when they were still children, often taking in unloved dolls and raising them as though they were her children. I found Little Women to be an enjoyable book to read, and as I said before, I am happy that I did get to read it eventually, and that this project allowed me to do that, because it is an important novel, I think, in American history. It is the girls' book. It is the book that you give to girls, to both as an instructional manual to be better, but also just as a kind of coming of age for women book. And I think, in that sense, it is an incredibly important novel. And besides even all of that, it's just a very well written. I really just liked it. The characters are likable. Marmee is everybody wishes that Marmee was their mother, and Joe and Meg and Beth and Amy were their sisters, and it's just nice. It's a nice novel. I think there is an interesting comparison to be made, one which I didn't make in this past video, to the other great Civil War novel in American history, was Gone with the Wind, which acts almost as the antithesis of Little Women, where Little Women is union and good, and the women strive to be good women. Scarlett O'Hara in it, on the other hand, is she's a bad mother, she's a bad wife, and she is obviously a Confederate. And I think when we get to that novel, which we also will eventually, I don't know where on the shelf that is though, but it is here somewhere. I think it's towards the very end. I do think that it'll be in a more appropriate time to discuss it, and one I look forward to doing. The next novel we will be reading is I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou, the great memoirist, probably the most famous memoirist in America, and certainly one of the greatest African American writers. And we see her life from early childhood to when she's 17. That's very good, and you should read it. Quick read. It's only like 300 pages. Much quicker than Little Women. Little Women, despite the size of it, it looks short. It's actually quite long. It's well, I mean, as I said, it's two novels shoved together, so it is a much heftier book than Maya Angelou's. But I hope that you will. But thank you for watching this the whole way through. If you have, I hope that you will give it a like, subscribe, but more importantly than all of that, I hope you leave a comment, because I love reading comments and I love discussing books. It's the whole reason I made this channel was so I could discuss books, and to give me a reason to read books, but mostly to discuss them, to have somebody to discuss with. So please leave a comment about Little Women and what you think about it, and the whole Third Great Awakening and the Christian moralism and anything else, really. Tell me what you liked about it, or if you liked it, or if you didn't like it. Although, how could you not like it? But do all that jazz. Thank you again. This is Reading with Steven. And, go out, keep reading.